Each and every year, thousands of people vanish or go missing under mysterious circumstances. Most cases are average and solvable, or at least there's a reasonably logical explanation for what had happened. For example, people go hiking and get lost. People are killed in disputes over illegal activities. People purposefully hurt themselves in remote places, and so on. However, just occasionally authorities will stumble across the unexplainable, where any reasonable answer is defied by the evidence, and there are more questions than answers. In these cases, we are forced to call in outside help for the investigation. This is something that few of us will ever speak about because the people that we are required to call aren't exactly who you would want to hear about investigating a potential crime scene. In fact, they will almost never show up in any trial notes. We do our best to play off any information they give us, or to find the information ourselves some other way. At the time this happened, I was a new officer assigned to a middle-of-nowhere tourist town in Maine. Virtually nothing ever happened there. The crime rate was so low that our station was essentially nothing more than a glorified log cabin. In the past, there had been some pretty horrific massacres and a couple of intriguing cases that remained unsolved. The only time that it gets even mildly busy now is during the late spring to early fall, hiking season, when tourists show up in droves. It's like the zombie apocalypse, only there are sweaty guys trying to impress their partners with the stamina they clearly don't have, and middle-aged women angry at nature itself instead of zombies. Personally, I think I would prefer it if zombies wanted to hike the section of the Appalachian Trail that passes our town. Sheriff Barrett was my chief back when I was a rookie. He was a grumpy old man with a gray mustache, thinning hair, and a no-nonsense attitude. There weren't more than a handful of us officers. I was the youngest and most inexperienced, so no one really paid me any mind. And Diane was the only woman in our station. She was a friendly, plump lady. She was also an officer, though she mostly handled the receptionist work rather than field patrols. Anyway, I digress. What I'm going to share with you is the first major case that I ever caught, and the reason that my job sucks. This happened in late spring of '98. It was a perfect year. Up until then, we had had no noteworthy incidents. Because I was new, my assignment was to patrol up and down a section of the trail leading up to the mountain. I was basically doing the work of a park ranger, ensuring the trail was clear of debris, checking on campers, and assisting with any injuries that hikers had sustained. It was a boring assignment. There's only so many sprained ankles that one can show enthusiasm for, as you can imagine, but I didn't mind it too much. I was outside in the fresh mountain air, and the surroundings were pristine. Everything was a lush green. There was a light, cool breeze filtering through the forest, and the nearby wildlife was vibrant. I putted along slowly on my ATV. I didn't want to scare or squash any wildlife since there were countless lizards and small mammals that would scurry into hiding as I passed by. Overhead, birds sang, and I was stopped often by tourists asking for directions and or photos. Apparently local law enforcement is exciting. Or maybe they just liked a man in uniform, who knows. When the call came in over the radio, it seemed pretty mundane. "Hey Charles, we've had a report of some campers due back that haven't returned. Do you think you could go take a look? Over." And Diane's cheerful voice had informed. She told me the approximate coordinates and a description while I made my way to the location. The group in question was supposed to be a group of 9, 4 adults and 5 children. The youngest member was 14 and the eldest was 51. It was a party of 2 families. As I approached the area, the forest around me gradually became still and silent. I didn't even notice at first, but soon the bird songs had stopped entirely. The only sound was the hum of my ATV and the crunching of twigs under the tires. It was eerie, to say the least. I rode into the clearing that the group was supposed to have camped and I shut off the engine. I could feel it in my bones that something just wasn't right. The atmosphere in that place seemed heavier somehow. The sun still shone, but it was as if the air itself was now an oppressive force. Looking around, I could see evidence that the group had been there. Patches of grass were flattened from tents and there were footprints in the dirt. A few odd things of note were that the fireplace was still smoldering slightly. It was against camping policy to leave any active fire unattended, and there were no personal effects left anywhere. You would expect that a group who couldn't be bothered dampening their fire would also be the kind of people to leave behind litter of some kind. You know, clothing, beer bottles, cans, etc. But there was nothing. Not a shred of anything anywhere. It really felt as if these people and everything they had brought with them simply evaporated. The logical part of my brain told me that they probably just moved on and had forgotten about the fire. However, if that was the case, why didn't they return yet? I came from the only direction that one can travel to return down the mountain, and I didn't pass any groups matching the description that I was given. As I investigated further, I noticed that an area of the brush seemed to have been damaged, squashed a bit as if people had moved through it. I wondered then if they had decided to go hiking off the marked trail and had called for backup before following the path of broken foliage. I didn't walk long before I noticed something bright blue high up in the trees ahead. "I'm Officer Charles, can anyone hear me?" I announced, but no response. A little jarred by this, I proceeded with slightly less confidence. The bad feeling that I was getting only intensified. I began to think the worst. What if it was a person hanging dead in the tree? I hadn't actually seen a dead body in person before. When I reached the object in question, I realized that it was a tent. Somehow, it had become entangled 30-odd feet up in the tree. How? I had no idea. "Hello, is there anyone in the area? This is Officer Charles, please make your presence known." I called again loudly, but still no response. Transfixed, I stared at the tent. It moved slightly in the breeze and I felt a chill run down my spine. It really was a very odd place for a tent to be. No way the wind could have blown it up there. Someone had to have placed it there. But why? There was nothing around, or so I thought. I began to feel watched and had the sudden urge to look around me. There was nothing. However, the crackle of my radio coming to life on my shoulder at that second scared me half to death. "Hello, Charles, it's Diane. I'm sorry that no one is available for backup. Can you please advise on your location? Over," she asked. "Hey, yeah, I'm just a little ways off the campsite. I found a tent in a tree quite some ways up. I don't know how I got up there, no sign of the group. I don't think I'm going to need backup after all, there's no one here. Over," I responded after taking a moment to regain my composure. That's a little odd, we'll keep us updated. Stay safe, over," she instructed. "Yes, ma'am, over." I grinned to myself. Somehow just hearing somebody else's voice was comforting. I continued down the path, passing by the tree with the tent, and walking until I came across a river. The edges of the river were muddy with obvious signs of multiple people crossing it. I could make out distinctive shoe imprints and something else. I really didn't know what it could be. It honestly looked to me like a dinosaur footprint. I took out my camera to take a few pictures for evidence, and I used a dollar bill for scale. The print was huge, well bigger than the dollar. I scanned along the length of the river to see if I could tell where they might have exited on the other side. There didn't seem to be any worn-down areas visible from where I stood, so I walked down a stream a ways. I assumed that if they traveled in the river for whatever reason, that it would be easier to move with the current rather than against it. Along the way, I saw more of the strange footprints. Some seemed to have had 3 toes and others 4. 2 different animals, maybe. And then I began to find items. First, I found a shoe and then cooking pots, clothing, and a partially torn sleeping bag. The further I went, the more common the items became. I called out at frequent intervals, making sure to give pause to listen for any response. No one ever answered. I felt that this was more than campers getting excited and exploring. This was people running for their lives from something. I followed the river more urgently until it started to get dark. I knew that I needed to turn back or I might end up getting lost myself, but reluctantly, I made the decision to head back to the clearing. I intended to return to the office and explain in greater detail what I had seen, so a rescue effort could be coordinated. I passed the tent tree and left a note there just in case the campers came back, and then I called Diane on the radio. "Diane, I'm almost back at the ATV now. Over," I reported. "Officer Charles, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you. Why didn't you answer? Over." She sounded angry, and I felt my palms start to sweat. I was still probationary. Was I going to be fired for this? I followed the river. I found supplies and some strange footprints. I took photos. Over. I tried to explain myself rapidly. I hadn't heard my radio go off at any point while I was searching. I assumed maybe it has been out of range while I was exploring. Good to know that if I had fallen into the river or something, I would have been totally on my own. "What kind of animal prints did you find?" Over. She asked calmer this time, but the mildly annoyed tone remained. "I'm not sure. They were big though. Maybe some kind of bear or something." Over. I tried. I knew without a doubt that this wasn't what they were, but I didn't want to seem like I had wasted time or didn't know what I was doing. "Just come on back now. The sheriff wants you back before it's dark. Hurry." Over. She stated tensely. The directions were sharp and left no room for interpretation. I think this kind of freaked me out more because I could tell that there was something she was withholding. When I got back to the original clearing, I saw immediately that my ATV was knocked over. The sight of seeing it laying there in the dirt made me want to run. That ATV was a four-wheeler and nearly 700 pounds. No way someone just accidentally had pushed it onto its side. I jogged over to correct the ATV's spatial positioning. I didn't want to seem scared or run, but walking felt too slow. I started up the ATV and that's when I heard it. From only a few hundred meters away, an inhuman scream erupted from the forest behind me. It was deafening. It had only been a single short sound, but it reverberated low and long through the trees. All the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I had never heard anything remotely comparable. Without a doubt, no known animal made that sound, and you can bet your bottom dollar that I made my way back to the main office freaking quick. When I arrived, Sheriff Barrett was waiting for me, standing with his arms folded, watching the horizon. I felt like a teenager caught sneaking home. "You made it back," he stated gruffly, and for the briefest moment, I thought that he looked relieved to see me. Someone knocked over the ATV, and I heard something in the forest. I tried to speak calmly while at the same time trying not to shake like a leaf. All the adrenaline in me that had kept me going was starting to wear off and my knees felt weak. I think you could probably tell from the look in my eyes how terrified I had been. "What'd you see out there?" he asked me more quietly. I don't know, Sheriff. The reported camping site was empty, though it's likely that the group had stayed there. When I investigated further, I found an unofficial trail that led deeper into the woods. I believe the party moved in that direction, as I found a tent tangled in some trees that way. I don't know how they got it up so high, but I followed their path along the river. I found some of their personal effects and documented large footprints. I took photos. I spoke as clearly as I could. I was trying to explain and demonstrate my quick thinking. "Show me the photos," he answered with a vague nod of acknowledgement to the rest of my story. Hurriedly, I pulled out the camera to show him. He took it and silently clicked through the photos with an ever-deepening frown on his brow. Should we call the neighboring county to organize a search and rescue? I asked hesitantly. No, it's too late in the day for that now. No one searches in those woods after dark. If they're alive out there, they'll have to survive the night on their own, he said grimly as he turned in his heel to walk back inside. Diane, call Linnaeus. It's back, he called ahead. Charles, you go home, and make sure to lock your doors tonight. You see anything move outside, you call me, you got it? He called back to me without breaking stride. I got the distinct feeling that I had definitely done something wrong, even if the only wrong that I had done was simply having been out there at all. There were things they weren't telling me and I wanted answers. I didn't know who Linnaeus was. I had never heard the name before, or how or why he would be able to help. However, what bothered me the most was not knowing, and now understanding what was out there. What exactly is in those woods? When I came into the office the following morning, the atmosphere was tense, and Diane sat stiffly at her desk, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a displeased, lips-pursed expression. Though she did give me a sly smile as I set down the box of donuts on the corner of her desk. Hope you're ready for this, kid, she commented as she eyed a jam-filled pastry. Hey, you know me, I'm ready for anything, I assured a little too enthusiastically, trying to inject some life back into the room. Where's Sheriff Barrett? I queried. In his office, knock first, she told me flatly. I muttered a half-hearted, right, and headed past the reception to the sheriff's office. As I walked, I contemplated what new development on yesterday's disappearances could have soured the mood so dramatically. Did they find a body? Or was it all just a wild goose chase that put Barrett in a bad mood for wasting his time? The door to his office opened abruptly just before I had made it to it, and Barrett came marching out. Well, I hope you're wrong, but I didn't call you here for no reason. He was speaking firmly to someone behind him. It's rare that I would be incorrect. An unfamiliar voice answered in a disturbingly neutral tone. No, Charles, you're in early. Good. I want you to meet Eric Linnaeus, the sheriff told me, noticing my presence for the first time when he turned away from his office. Behind him, another man followed. This man was of average height, reasonably handsome with dark hair and was well dressed. He seemed to be on the younger side, maybe early 20s, so I was surprised to see that despite his young appearance, he walked with a limp. His arm was bandaged in a sling close to his body, so the right sleeve of his jacket hung empty, and he relied on the cane in his left hand to walk. Taken aback, I didn't realize that I was staring until he made eye contact with me. My blood turned to ice. His right eye was sliced, or at least that was my initial thought. Looking closer, I realized that it was more like some abnormal form of heterochromia. To give you some idea, his left eye seemed normal-sized and was blue in color, but his other eye was slightly enlarged. The whites of that eye were more purpley and had a dark slit through the center where the iris should have been. It's not polite to stare, Eric informed me in monotone. His face gave no human emotion to connect with. I couldn't tell if he was embarrassed, angry, or hurt, but I felt guilty nonetheless. Sorry, I'm Charles. I apologized and I introduced myself. So, you're the one who discovered the abandoned campsite, he stated rather than asked. I nodded. Take me to the location. We will search anew from there. He continued as he moved toward the door. I hesitated. I wasn't sure whether or not I was supposed to take orders from this man. Do as he asks, you might learn something from him. In fact, consider him to be your new team lead from today until this matter is resolved. I want nothing to do with it. Sheriff Barrett muttered the last part, mostly to himself. We took the ATV out to the area where the campers had disappeared. Of course, the trail was by now closed since the disappearance, and so travel was a lot faster since I didn't have to worry about running over any tourists. The clouds from the day before had stayed, though it wasn't raining as they cast a gloomy haze over the forest and the air was muggy. It was the perfect weather for bugs, but the entire area was eerily silent. No birds or bugs made any sort of sound. It was like entering a dead zone where only the whir of the ATV engine broke the silence. "So, Sheriff Barrett called you in. Have you had special experience with this kind of case?" I asked to make light conversation. Eric was quiet for a moment before answering carefully. "You could say that." "I'm surprised then, you seem so young," I commented with a laugh. "I'm older than I look," he answered plainly. "Right, well, are you sure that you'll be okay out there? I mean, the terrain is kind of rough." Truthfully, I had my doubts about how we would be able to follow the camper's supposed direction when it led off trail and he was obviously injured. "I'll be fine." "How did you get hurt anyway? If you don't mind my asking." "You talk too much when you're nervous. It's like a chattering monkey." He cut me off bluntly and my mouth snapped shut. It's true that I did tend to talk more to release nervous energy, but a simple, "I don't want to talk about it," would have sufficed. That was probably the moment that I decided that I didn't like him. His strange monotone and lack of human emotion bothered me, especially in the unsettling ambience of the forest. It was almost like he took on the personality of the forest, or like it took on his. When we arrived at the abandoned site, everything was how I had left it the day prior. Silent, empty, and oddly terrifying. Eric struggled off the ATV and began to hobble around the space while I radioed back to let the sheriff know that we had made it to our destination. "You be careful out there now," he warned in a hard tone. "You stay near Linnaeus in case anything happens, you understand me? Over." "Copy that, over," I grumbled. It felt a little bit like I had been assigned a babysitter on a job that I was more than capable of handling on my own. Still begrudging, I hopped off the ATV to follow Eric. Walking over the trampled site was eerie. The sound of that inhuman scream came back to me in my thoughts, and I felt the tickle of fear creeping into my body. Ahead, Eric was headed down the same path that I had traveled the day prior. "There's a tree with a tent caught high in the branches. There's about where I found the footprints," I spoke as I moved over to him. "I can see it, but the rain has probably washed away any footprints," he answered. Unfortunately, he was right. There was no sign of any path past the tent tree. The storm that blew through during the night had disturbed whatever evidence may have been left, and I doubted we could track anything specific now. This is why it surprised me when Eric continued on. He stumbled with his cane through the brush to the river where he had stopped to look around. "You said you found items scattered about downstream, but no signs of exiting footprints," he asked as he awkwardly crouched down to inspect the river's edge. "Yeah, if they went into the river, I never found the spots where they had exited. I only found some more of those strange prints down that way." I pointed downstream. "Did you travel upstream?" he asked without looking up from the river. "No," I admitted. Perhaps I was imagining a disappointed eye roll or some other indication of disapproval, because he simply stood up and started making his way upstream without saying another word. We traveled for quite some time, and there didn't seem to be any kind of indication that the missing campers had come this way, and I was surprised at how nimbly Eric was able to make his way along the uneven surface beside the river. Progress forward had stopped when we had reached the base of a large waterfall. It seemed unlikely that anyone would try to climb over it, so I assumed the campers must have gone downstream after all. That or there really was no way to tell now where they had exited. "They left the water here," Eric announced a few meters away from the base of the waterfall. "How can you tell?" I asked skeptically. Eric paused a moment now, as if he were deciding what exactly he should tell me. "It's just a very good guess, it seems logical," he shrugged. "And I'm just supposed to go with that?" I asked flatly. "Yes," he answered simply, and began to make his way off into the woods. I didn't answer. I followed because I knew that I had no choice in the matter. If he was my team leader for the time being, it was my responsibility to follow his lead without argument. However, it was now in my opinion that he had no idea really of what he was doing. He was probably just some hotshot that had lied in his resume, and we would be lost within an hour. So when, after less than 15 minutes, we found a stuffed teddy bear amongst the foliage, I felt my pride shrivel up. It seemed Eric did know what he was doing. "Have you ever seen a dead body before?" Eric asked me calmly as he picked up the bear. "No," I admitted. "Why?" "It seems likely that we'll come across the body soon. Please do your best to prepare yourself for such an event," he said carefully. Something in the way he said it almost made me feel like he already knew we were going to find someone dead. There was no doubt to his dry voice. I began to imagine what we would find. The child that owned this teddy bear, their parents, their siblings, most likely huddled together somewhere they thought was shelter for the night, only for the elements to overcome them. How was I going to explain to the families that I could have saved their loved ones if only I had traveled upstream yesterday? "Charles," Eric speaking interrupted my thoughts and I felt my stomach drop. Ahead the trees were thinning into a small clearing, and I could see bright-colored patches in the space. I didn't need to be told. I could tell they were campers' clothing, but I didn't want to consider what if there were people still inside the clothes. "You can wait here if you would like," Eric told me more softly. I cleared my throat. "No, it's dangerous to separate," I told him, trying to sound as uncaring as he did. "Very well," he answered and stumbled onward. What we found in that clearing was worse than I could have ever imagined. The clothing that was visible through the trees did indeed contain bodies, but they were not huddled together for warmth. No, they had been gone longer than that. Their bodies were strewn all about the clearing, torn and mangled. They laid with varying expressions of fear and pain. The worst one for me was the little girl. She couldn't have been more than 14. We found one of the arms on the opposite side of the clearing. It was only identifiable because of the size and because it was still in the yellow sleeve of the jacket her torso was wearing. Aside from all that, all the bodies were common in another way. They were all missing their eyes and tongues. The smell was surprisingly bearable. I guess they hadn't had too much time to fester, but still I felt nauseous. "Take a moment. Go sit over by the edge away from all this," Eric told me firmly. I wanted to argue, I wanted to prove myself, but the swallowed breakfast threatening to make its return from my stomach subdued me. The first time you see a dead body, it changes you in profound ways. When your first time is seeing other humans, people with lives, thoughts, feelings, and emotions torn apart, decimated in the way these bodies were, well, they leave a scar on your very soul. I started to understand Eric more then. He wasn't just an average guy. He was someone who had seen this kind of thing often enough that it had worn away his entire humanity. "I'll call this in," I murmured, trying to settle my stomach as I watched Eric investigate each body part. "No, until we find the animal responsible, it's safer if there are fewer people on the mountain," he said calmly. "What kind of animal did this?" I asked meekly. When he answered this time, he didn't look up from the partially eaten, severed leg at his feet. "No animal you would be familiar with. It's a product of evil, a demon of sorts." When Eric had told me a demon was responsible for the slayings, I burst out laughing. It was brought on by a combination of my nerves and my genuine belief that he was joking with me to lighten the mood. The outburst of laughter evaporated as Eric's flat eyes turned to me. I knew by then that his expression never changed, but I could have sworn he was contemplating killing me or something. There was a silent fury burning there, or maybe nothing at all. Shark eyes, that's what he had. After my outburst, I coughed awkwardly and settled into silence. Eric continued whatever it was that he was doing, examining the bodies, taking photos, and gathering samples. I assumed those were to be used as evidence. We stayed in that clearing for quite some time with the victims. In my head, I played out various scenarios of what I thought might have happened. I imagined the group fleeing terrified in the darkness, running blindly through the foliage with low tree branches catching at their clothing and hair. I thought of one of them the morning before, packing up their campsite and heading off on an unmarked trail. Maybe they saw something of interest that lured them in that direction. Then realizing their danger and running until they met the river, frantically deciding which way to try to run next. One of them must have decided to run downstream, perhaps to deceive whatever had pursued them. I imagined them later in darkness, holding on to each other desperately, trying to stay quiet in their chosen hiding places. But maybe they never even made it to the first night. Maybe all the terror that I imagined never happened. Perhaps whatever it was that set upon them was so efficient that they never even had time to be afraid at all. Eventually, I called it in over the radio that we had found multiple casualties, and Diane assured me that once the mountain was safe, they would send in rescue workers to recover the bodies. More time passed and it began to rain. It was only a light misting of water that settled a dampness over clothing and left small droplets forming on leaves. This is when Eric limped back over to me. His cane sank slightly into the damp earth as he leaned on it. "You can go back now if you would prefer," he stated, though it came across as an instruction. "It's probably against policy to leave when there's some man-eating animal around," I answered gloomily. "Perhaps," he answered after a moment's pause, and I noticed for the first time a smile was starting to form on his lips as he continued. "However, you are welcome to leave nonetheless." I felt my blood boil. This guy was implying that I leave because he thinks I can't handle this situation. Yeah, I might be new to the job, but at least I look old enough to shave. I stood and looked him square in his good eye. "I don't need to run home if that's what you're suggesting," I told him firmly. "Very well. Come," he said simply, moving off into the forest. "It's against procedure to leave a crime scene unattended," I called after him, utterly peeved at his nonchalant arrogance. "So stay," he shrugged. "My job requires that I continue on. You don't think that I was called here simply to give a nod of approval that this is a dangerous animal you have here, now do you?" "What exactly is your job again?" I retorted. "To eliminate the threat," he answered bluntly. Frustrated, I said nothing more and followed after him into the forest. I knew this was against procedure, but he was my leader for the day and out its procedure to follow the orders of a direct leader. Though his orders were vague at best, he was following some distinct trail I couldn't determine. It was almost like following a native tracker, except they tended to at least explain what they were looking for or following. This man walked sharing his navigation, turning at different points with seemingly no indication as to why. I began to think that he was actually lost and just trying to keep up appearances. But then I noticed that his damaged eye seemed to be seeing or looking. If nothing else, it was definitely moving independently from his good eye, and whichever way it looked in, he moved to follow that direction. A chill ran down my spine. That was certainly one of the creepiest things that I had ever seen. It's within all human instinct that things that look human but not deeply unsettle us, and I was beginning to have my doubts about just how human this man was. That's not to say I believe in anything supernatural, more than I believe humanity can leave a person. After a few hours of hiking through the woods and beating up the shrubbery, Eric stopped. He set his cane aside and, to my infinite surprise, began unbandaging his damaged arm. "What on earth are you doing?" I had asked, dumbfounded. "My job," he replied without elaborating. Under the bandages, his arm was an odd purple-black color, similar to his bad eye. It was bumpy in a weird way and seemed to have what I can only describe as scales on it. His hand was disproportionately large with long claws where his nails should have been. He flexed it casually, opening and closing his hand as if he hadn't done so in quite some time. I recoiled in horror. Stumbling backwards, I nearly fell over a fallen log. I couldn't make sense of exactly what I was seeing. Had this guy had some serious body modification surgery or something? Was he a monster like that in a children's story? I settled on the first option as he grinned over at me. This was the first time I had seen him smile in full, and I immediately noticed why he didn't smile with teeth normally. The teeth on the right side of his face below his purple eye were all oversized and pointed. His gums were the same discolored purple as his eye. "Scared," he mused. What the heck did you have done?" I stammered out, too in shock to think of anything else to say. "Why, I assume I did it by choice," he asked instead, clearly amused. "I told you that you were welcome to remain with the bodies." Even when he spoke now, his voice was still dull, devoid of emotion, and that was far more unsettling. "If you're gonna shoot me, aim well. I don't take kindly to that reaction." He warned, and I realized then that I had unholstered my gun. I couldn't remember even doing that, but I was gripping it tightly as my thoughts collected themselves in my head. It was starting to make sense. Eric was the one. He had done that to those campers. That's why he knew which way they had run. That's how he knew to follow the trail that I couldn't find. He was a killer with some horrific body modifications. He probably got off in the fear people had seen his appearance. They probably thought that a demon had come for them. I struggled to figure out some way to gain the upper hand in this situation. He had all the advantages. He had led me further out in the woods for hours, and it was going to be dark soon, and I didn't carry as many rounds in me as I should have. I work in a recreational park, for God's sake. I'm not likely to need that many bullets. Who would even thought I would be sent out with a psycho? I felt a slight stab of betrayal when I thought more about that. Did Diane and Barrett know about Eric? Both had looked displeased to see him. Was I a sacrifice here? Were they all in on it? My thoughts were interrupted suddenly then by a familiar chilling screech. The same one that I had heard the night before, only it was closer, much closer. I noticed then that Eric wasn't really even looking at me. His attention was focused on something past me. A wave of nausea washed over me as I slowly turned toward the sound. The creature that made it was crouched barely 20 feet away from me. It was the size of a bear and had no face. Instead, it only had a mass of teeth that extended ridiculously far back into its skull, with a patch of wrinkled skin on top of its head where a human might have hair. Despite this, somehow, I felt as though it was watching me. The wrinkles on its head suddenly flared open, and I realized it was taking a deep breath in. It then turned more whole-bodily toward me, focusing its malice on me. "Not going to shoot it," Eric mocked calmly. His voice cut through the tension like a sharp knife. I had forgotten about him for a moment. Truthfully, when facing something that defied all reason, I felt a primal terror so pure that I can't even accurately describe it. My mind struggled desperately to rationalize this thing that was absolutely nothing alike to anything that I had ever before experienced nor even heard of. Time seemed to slow down for me, because I remember the next few details extremely vividly. First was how calm Eric looked. It was like he was looking at something as common as a household dog. Second was that when the creature jumped at me, its entire body uncoiled horrifically. It had no tail, but folds of skin along its sides between its limbs flared open, so that it glided on makeshift wings. I didn't have time to scream or even the time to raise my weapon, but somehow Eric suddenly stood between the creature and myself. He shoved me back hard and I fell into the mud. I heard my gun go off just once as I landed, because my finger had slipped on the trigger. I have no idea where the shot went. I was too busy watching the scene before me unfold. I was certain that Eric was about to be dismembered by this beast when he raised his disfigured arm. Putting it between himself and the creature, he slashed through the thing mid-flight like a knife through butter. Blood sprayed in all directions over him, over me, and over the surrounding vegetation. It landed in 2 separate pieces with individual impacts. The chunks twitched, writhing on the ground as if the thing were still alive and trying to reassemble. In the cold air, steam rose from the pieces, and the soft rain expanded the blood pooling exponentially. When I regained my voice, I stammered out, "What was that thing?" "I don't give them names," Eric answered, now cradling his monster arm in his good arm. "Now get up, I want to get back before midnight." For a few more moments, I was too stunned to move, and when I tried to stand, my legs gave way twice before I succeeded. They felt like jelly. I wanted to ask more questions, but I couldn't find the right words to form the sentences, so I merely followed Eric's lead and began walking back. I noticed that he now walked without a limp and without his cane. It hung in the crook of his elbow instead. I thought better of asking about it though, especially given that half an hour prior, I had been about ready to shoot him. Eric and I walked back into the office like zombies, damp from the rain, covered in blood and dirt. Sheriff Barrett looked up from his newspaper and scoffed. Cover that thing up," he grumbled, obviously referring to Eric's demon arm as he tossed him a fresh roll of bandages. Eric caught the roll effortlessly with an amused look on his face. "Always a warm greeting," he commented as he began to rewrap his limb. "Is it alright if I put in my incident report tomorrow?" I asked to break the tension. "No," Sheriff answered gruffly. "No," I echoed, disappointed. "No, I don't want to see any report on this. I don't believe in any of that mumbo-jumbo stuff. I don't want to hear another word on it, actually." "What are we supposed to tell the families?" I asked, trying to subdue the irritation in my voice. I had risked my life for this assignment. "Diane has prepared the report for you. Read it, repeat what it says if anybody asked you," he instructed. Somehow that didn't surprise me. I thought back to the few rare cases in the past. I couldn't help but wonder if each was a similar situation to the one that I just experienced. I wondered also about when the next time another incident would happen. Would I be able to return to my normal duties while thinking about that thing out there? About whether or not there were more of them. It made me anxious to think about the next time a hiker disappeared, or a campsite was found abandoned. Would the explanation be something normal? Or would we be calling Eric Linnaeus again? I shuddered at the thought. I didn't want to see his arm again anytime soon. As it was, Eric left silently without any of us noticing. He vanished from our little office and melted into the darkness like a ghost. I was relieved when I realized that he had gone, but also slightly guilty. I realized that everybody probably felt that way about him, relief when he was gone. I imagined him walking alone in the rain. Perhaps he would go home, or maybe he would move on to the next call to help in facing some unexplained phenomena. The man had saved my life, and probably the lives of others as well. I should have at least thanked him.